Hello and welcome to this session on communicating expertise. We call this training a primer for becoming a popular scientist, and it was developed by myself, Josepine Fernow, and my colleague Anna Holm here at Uppsala University. And we're doing this for the Human Brain Project and eBrains as part of the capacity building activities there. So today we'll be talking about media, the risks and benefits of communicating science, and there is a lot to win by talking about your work. And there's also hands-on capacity building to help you develop a skill set for science communication and to be able to build your own popular science narrative, adapting that to your audience. And there's a little bit of media training towards the end of this as well. So we have this idea of a general public. We talk a lot about reaching the general public with our results. But in real life, there's actually a lot of overlapping publics, and we're all members of those publics, and we're members of several publics. So there's experts in your own field, and there is a lot of experts in neighboring fields. So if you look at your colleagues in your office, they'll probably have lots of expertise, not necessarily the same as yours, and sometimes you don't even understand each other. There's journalists who are very well read on your topics. There's press officers. There is other PhD students. There's your parents and children. There's research funders, experts, friends who know a lot about your work. But there's also journalists and experts in other domains. There's journalists in the same domain as yours. There's school children, civil society, policymakers, activists, and there's other small bubbles of people that we just don't know how to reach, like flat earthers, and there's lots of conspiracy theories and different worldviews than your own. And we have to realize and accept that these are overlapping. And we are often members of several. So we need to do not just reaching the general public, we also do a lot of cross-professional and cross-disciplinary communication to be able to be understood, especially in a multidisciplinary environment like a big European research project. So today we'll be talking about why we might want publicity in the first place, because there's a lot of reasons why we want to reach out. We also need to know that media is a set of arenas that have special rules, and our recommendation, our strong recommendation, is to know why you engage with media before you do. And we say to you that you should come prepared, which is also why we teach you today to build a good story, prepare for an interview, and how to deal with difficult questions. And also, very important, what to do in case there's negative publicity. So the recipe for communications that we want to share today is stating a fact about the world or context, explaining in relation to that why your work is important, sending a message based on your research, which of course should be sound, calling to action to get the audience to do something, to read more, to respond, to react to question, to start thinking. And we want you to do that in plain language. So the mission for science is also engaging with society. If we look at a Swedish university in Lund, they provide guidelines with 7 principles for good research communication that builds on recommendations from others. They talk about correctness, relevance, uncertainty, research status, authorship, perspective, and conflict of interest. And this is all about transparency. And they say that it's in the interest of researchers, the university and society, that findings and insights on methodology and limitations of research are made accessible for public debate, political decisions, the business community, and society as a whole. And that sounds easy, but it's really difficult to do because we are looking at different kinds of arenas. There's also an idea that transparency plays a role for public acceptance. So the League of European Research Universities, LERU, have published a good practice for communicating animal research at universities. And we know that this is contested and that the general public opinion is divided on the use of animals in research. And LERU is suggesting that this could be due to a lack of openness and transparency about why and how animals are used in research, that people might just not be aware of the stringent rules and regulations that we have to deal with to do such experiments. And universities and others, there's lots of R&D companies and pharma industry, for example, could be more vocal about the benefits that animals in research bring to both basic and applied research, and also transparent about how we work with the 3 Rs: reduce, refine, and replace, for example. So it sounds lovely to be transparent, but media has a different logic, because you can be correct and report all of those relevant circumstances, clarify your methods, point to every uncertainty, describe the status of your field in detail, position your results in relation to everyone else's, report all of the authors, all of the contributors, anyone who gave review, And be clear about your own expertise and perspective in relation to that when you engage in debate. You can state any potential conflict of interest. And then we are sort of facing the reality that if you're going to do this on Twitter, we only have 280 characters, and we'll realize that this list is not possible. So you need to start taking decisions. And the sad truth is that people don't really care about your methods, because we want to know, as members of a general public, how your results will impact us. If you're a journalist, you won't risk boring your readers, your audiences, with details that might not be relevant to them. And of course, as a scientist, a researcher, it doesn't mean that you should not adhere to ethical principles and be transparent when you communicate about your work. But what you need to do is to understand that media is a set of arenas that have different rules and special rules, and that science needs to adapt to fit to this media landscape. And I'm guessing you've heard this term, media landscape, and just a quick note on why we call it a landscape. This media ecology theory that describes how media technology and communication affects human environments. It's coined in the 60s, claiming that media acts as an extension of our senses and that communication technology is the primary cause of social change. And if we think about book printing, we can understand what that means. We call it ecology because it describes an environment where we use a medium, what these media are, and how they affect society. And that creates a kind of landscape for science communication. So what we do is basically input research agendas and results in a machine that churns this and delivers it to different publics. And that includes traditional media, print, press, for example, but also digital and social, and the devices that we use to access those different media. So the technology, and the technology is what drives and sort of changes the way we communicate. And then we want to talk a little bit about mediatization and hype. So mediatization is a process where mass media is influencing society, and we can compare it to globalization and modernization. It influences everything from culture to politics, education, sports, and of course, science. And that's forcing everyone, politicians, civil society, and scientists and researchers, to adapt how we communicate, changing the message and style of that communication to suit mass media. And hype plays a big part in driving the adoption of technology. And we're doing this in now 2022. And if anyone remembers the Clubhouse app that was hyped in the spring of 2021, we can understand what hype means. It's exaggeration. It's often used for marketing new innovations, focusing on a perceived value of a trend or an innovation. But that also happens in science communication. And we can think of, for example, genetics and genomics as an example, where the first time the human genome was sequenced, there was a lot of hype surrounding that. And if we buy this hype, we might start thinking that genetic information is special in a way that makes us more reluctant to maybe donate for research, or there might be a cost in hyping innovation as well. So if we aim for public acceptance and interest from research funding organizations, it might become more difficult to do research. So I think this makes a good example because it's so long ago that it's still relevant for us today. So mediatization and hype, the way that media frames and describes science has an impact on science and society because it's shaping the way that researchers communicate. But the media landscape also shapes the way we communicate because it creates new arenas for science communication. And people like myself, communications people, PR professionals and journalists, we're no longer the ones mediating the communication. Because we live in this post-scientific, post-fact, post-truth society. It's been called different things, but it also means that you can do it yourself. But when you do that, you have to remember that different media have different rules. There is a difference in the ethical and legal status, and also in the accessibility, availability, and filtering. So for traditional media, they're governed by press ethics, and they have publishers that can be held responsible. For content producers like journalists and PR professionals, there are guidelines. And social media platforms, on the other hand, they have policies, terms and conditions that you have to agree with to use the platform, but they're not responsible for the user's content. And traditional media, they have editors who decide what should be published, and they pick content for a pre-existing audience. And that means they also want to have influence on how that content is packaged. But anyone can start a podcast. You can start your own YouTube channel or Twitter account, and you can build an audience for your own content. So I think we need to sort of ask ourselves if that's a problem for science communication. I mean, there's lots of benefits when scientists can communicate with publics and stakeholders directly, but you are in an environment where you're competing with facts that are generated, interpreted, or presented by others in a time when science is no longer considered truth. And in case you defame someone, you're also liable, and you have to be responsible for the platform that you're using. So then we get into this concept of echo chambers, filter bubbles, and then the sort of problem of balancing views. So if you want to believe things like the Earth is flat, you will believe that regardless of what facts say, if you believe in those facts. And if you're in an echo chamber, it means that your beliefs are amplified or reinforced by communication, regardless of whether that communication is supporting your worldview or in disagreement with your worldview. And that's a practical problem for science communication, because you will not reach reluctant audiences. And even if you do, they won't believe you. And if you include opposing views in your narrative, you might be also contributing to a false balance, or what's sometimes called both sidesism. And that balance might have its virtues, but sometimes those two sides don't deserve an equal weight. So if journalism, or if you in your own popular science writing start giving all the viewpoints the same scientific legitimacy, because that's basically what you're doing if you're giving them enough space, then that might become a problem. So if science is examining evidence and it's building on the hypothesis that has the most support, if the other side gets the same weight, the same space, we might start questioning who the expert is and who drives the narrative. And then in situations where you see two sides being put next to each other, we need to ask ourselves if there's transparency then, and we're getting back to these 7 principles: correctness, relevance, uncertainties, research status, authorship, perspective, and if there are any conflicts of interest. So that's something to be on the lookout for, and also in your own writing to think about what happens if you present two opposing views and you give them the same weight. Who is then the expert? So communication always includes making choices. So you need to know what you want to achieve, and you need to ask yourself a couple of questions. For example, if you know what you're trying to achieve, and if you're contributing to hype, if you're building trust, or if you're eroding trust with your narrative. And then there's also the question of who might want to use your results and for what purpose, because sometimes genetic research or I don't know, historical research might play into a narrative that some groups are using for political reasons. Think about whose language you're using, because sometimes it's also contested. And if you're intentionally or unintentionally taking a stand, or if you're both siding, you might want to do that, but you might also, without thinking about the consequences, entering into debates. So the other thing to ask yourself, if you've identified any personal risks, security risks, for example, if you're communicating about animal data, and if you pick the right channel. So what I'm saying is I'm not saying that you shouldn't communicate and you shouldn't talk about controversial topics, but pay attention when you're trying to be good. So we want to be inclusive. Right now, there's a debate going on about gender neutral language, or whether to use man and woman, or male and female. And if we strive for inclusiveness and representation, if we want to include everyone, that comes with risk, because you might be picking sides in polarized debates. If you want to do that, that's fine. But if it's not your intention, think a couple of times. And there's also the risk of using people as tokens. Sometimes we want to be so inclusive and we want to represent everything that you might not be portraying the population. You might be using people as tokens because you want to represent everyone. If you're trying to avoid risk, there's also risk. If you're downplaying something important and you're trying to write your way out of trouble, for example, if you don't want to say that results were only in mice, we might be hyping something, or we might be promising things that results are not actually, it might not be a medicine on the market for people yet. If you're being transparent, there's also a bit of risk. And sometimes we have to accept that we can't control the narrative, and also the fact that science is part of society and that we have to deal with current popular debate. So there's a question then why you should bother. And I would say that it's because it's all about impact. This is the European horizon way of looking at impact, so scientific, societal, and economic. So a tweet can help peers discover your work. That could give you a citation, that could give you scientific impact. Public understanding might support public acceptance and uptake of technology and results. And then being understood could support technology transfer or could get you a job. And it's also good PR for the university, for the company, for your department, for the group, for projects, for funders. But it's really a powerful opportunity for you as an individual to spread your own message. And it positions yourself as someone with expertise. It also makes you accessible. And it's a way of giving back to society, because at the end of the day, a lot of taxpayers are funding your salaries, funding research. So if you want to communicate your research, then start asking yourself some questions. Do you want to inform or influence? So is that being an activist or being someone who's just providing information? How can you balance opposing views in your own writing? Is there a way to avoid alienating audiences? Again, if there's contested terms, for example, can you reach different audiences? Is there a way to reach into a filter bubble? Or maybe you want to reach a patient audience, then maybe you need to go through a patient organization to do that. Is there something you can win about being open and transparent when it comes to controversial topics? If there's nothing to win, or if the win comes at a cost, there might be a way for you to put some risk mitigation strategies in place. And then the big question is how you can be transparent about scope and limitations in very different formats. And I would say link to the source. So there's two routes, basically. You can get publicity for your conclusions by talking about your results. So typically, this is what we think of when we talk about press releases or press newsletters. We want to sort of share something that happened. We want to share a published result. But you can also raise awareness and generate interest in your research questions by talking about why your research matters. And you can do that in an editorial kind of way, or by giving an expert interview, for example. And the good thing about this is you position yourself as someone with expertise who people might turn to. And if you get your research question on the agenda, the political agenda, there might be some funding coming your way, or there might be some calls for projects in your area in the future. So if you want your results to have impact, again, you can send this kind of press release, but be aware that that's quite a particular process. So when we talk about press releases, they're not web news or newsletter news. They are texts with contact details going through specific platforms, reaching journalists. So journalists are basically subscribing to this kind of information. What you can also do is to contact someone, contact a journalist before publication. You can put your paper on, you can have an embargo and let them have a couple of weeks to research and to do something really nice with it, and then have that as news when your paper is published. So this is all sort of thinking about news media, and that's how we sort of often think about communicating results. But it's not always the most effective pathway to impact. You can use new or sort of social media, they're not so new anymore, but you can also do other things. If you want impact, you can give decision makers good arguments in a policy brief or in a meeting where your input is needed. That's also a communication. You can engage stakeholders in a webinar or a public-facing event. You can go to someone else's event and give a talk. You can write editorial for journal, blog, or newspapers, engage in the debate, get on someone else's podcast because they already have an audience, or you can publish something on the sort of your workplace website, or you can pick a channel that gets your message across to the right audience. And what you can do then yourself is to make sure to amplify your message through your own social media, your colleagues' social media, through your official channels, your organization's official social media channels. So then caring about new media is actually important because podcasts, blogs, and social media have a much lower threshold, and they reach specific stakeholder groups, and they also build your altmetric score. And that's a way to measure visibility. I think most of us have seen these colorful donuts. It's a key performance indicator. What it does is it measures whether the DOI link is posted. So basically some spiders going around on websites checking for DOIs. And it allows you to monitor the conversation that's going on about your work. So if you see this, you can click on it and then you can see the latest tweets, for example. And these different colors will also indicate where you're getting the attention. So you will see if it's shared a lot on Twitter or Facebook or Reddit, for example, or if it's in news or if it's in policy documents. So it's a good way for you to be able to sort of visually see whether your work is being cited, being talked about, the DOI is being posted in in all of these different platforms. But what it also does is if you see your score getting above 20, it means it's one of the more talked about. I think 20 is considered a good altmetric score, was at least when I recorded this. So this is different, I think. Communication is different from your regular scientific dissemination narrative, where you normally use an academic language, you report on your method, you look at small details, often focus on filling gaps in a field, often ending with a conclusion, and use a more rational kind of narrative, building on consensus often. And if you want to communicate that to different publics, to someone who's outside your field, who has a different profession, you need to turn that around. So what we do then is we use a plain language. We tell a story that goes from A to B with a focus on the big picture and context. What I often do when I do editorial work on scientists' texts, I take the last paragraph, the conclusion, I paste it on the top, and that already changes it. So you start with a conclusion. If you try and include emotion, it makes it much more relatable, and often you portray opposing views. So again, if you turn your narrative around this way, the first 25, 30 words should summarize the whole story, focusing on what's new or different about your findings. And then you need to list your key messages, basically why this is important for your audience. You explain by providing evidence to back up any claims you make in your key messages. And then if you want to explain, if you want to give details, consider putting like a fact box at the end. So because when you communicate, it's big picture, it's context. What you do then is you prime your audience, you frame the issue, you explain what you've done, you prove your point, and you do that in plain language, so in a conversational way. And that means telling people why this is important, providing context, helping them understand, and then you provide evidence by reporting your results. I said plain language, conversational tone, but it's a way of communicating that's to the point and it's without convoluting. And I think that's where scientific language often hides the key message because you provide a lot of detail. So what you need to do is to write in a way that allows the reader to understand your content at once. That's the first time they read it. And then we are in a digital society, so language online also raises demands on us as writers. We have an accessibility directive that's becoming law across Europe. It is already law in a lot of countries that requires that we provide equal access to the internet for anyone who's experiencing any permanent, temporary, or situational disability. And that's anything from being legally blind to having a migraine or a headache and not being able to focus your eyes. So for someone who needs a screen reader, someone who needs captioned video because they can't read, someone who's doing it on their phone, if you have no computer experience, someone who needs clear structure or magnification or keyboard navigation. So we need to write for all of those people. And that means we're moving beyond now readable to something that we call perceivable. We need to provide alternatives to any image, video, audio content. So if you do a lecture like this, really you have to be able, if you put on YouTube, you can get the automatic subtitles. But if you're doing video, if you're doing audio, you need to make sure that people who cannot hear are also able to take part in that information. So closed captions, image descriptions, transcripts. It needs to be adaptable, so the content should be presented in different ways. So the layout, if you're on a big screen, you can have a table that looks a certain way. But if someone's on their mobile phone, that's a very, very different thing, right? Because you can't read small text on a screen. So you have to make sure that this is adaptable without losing information or structure in your information. So you can have images, but then try and explain the same thing in text. You also need to ensure that content is distinguishable so that colors work for colorblind and there's enough contrast. So if you're using colors, a color legend in your paper or wherever you present, try and print it in black and white. And if it's still legible, if you can still read and see the difference, then you have enough contrast. Audio needs to be distinguishable, which means we can't be slurring our language. We also need to watch out for strong accents, because people should be able to hear and understand. So if you talk really fast, then you need to subtitle. And if you have images of text, that doesn't work because that requires visual and not everyone can see. So good writing then is accessible when you build clear structures so people can navigate with the tab, for example. Clear links, clear headings so people understand what's happening behind that link and what's underneath that heading. You describe images, audio, and video so someone who cannot see them is able to look at maybe a text that's hidden in the image, or there's caption. And you need to make sure that content is readable, understandable. You don't use abbreviations or unusual or difficult words without explaining them at least. And then make sure that links work in screen readers. And that requires writing in a different way. So this is an example. If you have this text, if you can see it, you say, watch this video about cooking in 18th century America, or read more about cool cats and kittens. But a screen reader often sees all of these links at the end of the text. And that's a link saying video and a link saying read more. And in a long text, there might be several video and read more. So it's really, really difficult for people to know what's behind. So if you do this, instead, you need to think about the way you link. And sometimes that requires writing in a different way. So instead, you link in cooking in 18th century America and in cool cats and kittens. It's much easier for me, if I'm looking at this through my screen reader, to know what's going to happen if I click on either of those links. So plain language, how to use it, is having your audience in mind, using an active voice, addressing your reader in the first person. So using you as a pronoun is a really good thing. Using one idea per paragraph, and really short works for web. Again, people watch video and read websites on their phones. So short paragraphs, short sentences. Remembering that most people are not native English speakers, also really helpful. And moving away from jargon and using common words that we all understand. If common terms are not precise enough, this is a text that I wrote for an IMI project called Conception. What you need to do is to take some time to explain. So in this case, we have pregnancy outcomes. And then we have that in italics. So it's clear for me as a reader that I don't need to understand pregnancy outcomes. But if I want to Google this, that's the term I use, right? So then we say that's the stillbirth or the child being small for the time, because the phrase gestational age might not work for everyone. But I still know gestational age is what I Google. And then you make sure that you're not forgetting to frame this, also giving the context so it's clear for people why this is important in this case. It's about pregnancy and medicine. So of course, if it's about migraines, it's also important to know that women are 3 times more likely to suffer from migraines than men. So checking if that worked, what you should do is probably ask a non-native speaker, a teenager, to read it, because that's a good level. You can also go to any readability index and test. There are several. Most of them are for English. You can check if there's one in your language. But you should remember that it's an index. It's a blunt tool that counts words and maybe looks at grammar and looks at the length of sentences. It cannot test if your text can be understood. So you still need a human for that. So what if it goes wrong? What you should do is to anticipate. So have a look at the journalist's questions. So they should be transparent about the framework and topic of the interview. And you do have the right to receive information about that. What you can do is also inform the communications team in your project, in your organization, and tell them that you've been approached. And you should consider only answering questions about your own research. So be wary of biased, off-topic, weirdly framed, sort of widely framed questions if it's too big. And if you're thinking about who you're the spokesperson for, it's your research. You know your results, and that's you're the one to talk about them. But if it's about a project, for example, maybe a spokesperson from the project should be the one answering, and you can always redirect that. You can also involve leadership and communications people in the project and in your own organization to help identify the right person to answer a question. You don't have to answer. And if an interview didn't go well, and if you spotted negative publicity about your work, about a colleague's work, about the department you're working at or the project, you should communicate that experience with the communications people and management as soon as possible, because they can help you figure it out. Okay, so if it happened, there are things we can actually do. If you've been misrepresented, you can ask for a correction. Problem is, of course, that the message is already out there. But your comms people in the project or in your organization and the press office, they can help you mitigate communications risks, because they can help you spread your own message in channels that reach the same audience. So even if you ask for a correction that's going to be printed in the paper the next day, if you, for example, think about other ways of reaching that same audience, there's a way of getting your message out. So it works in this way. So you can write your own key message in editorial opinion for a journal, for a blog, engage in debate. You can give a new interview or give a statement to a journalist that you trust. And you can join forces with colleagues and peers and issue statements as a collective. And you can use social media in turn to spread that message, to amplify it. So take-home messages: when you communicate, know why you do it, choose the channels that suit your need. Don't provide all of the details because you're not the audience. Write for your audience, don't write for yourself and your peers, and get to know your audience and adapt your message and figure out why your research is important to them. So when you write about research, it demands a couple of things from you. It requires that you put what's most important first, and that you explain what's new and why it matters. And always remember that a useful conversation, again, is stating a fact about the world or context, explaining why your work is important, sending a message that's based on sound research, calling to action. So you're asking the audience to do something, to either read, respond, react, or question. Think about your work anyway. And you do that in plain language. And you need to adapt that to the media landscape where you're communicating. So this is a suggestion to write a clear and click-worthy headline that's not clickbaiting. Let the first 25 to 30 words summarize the whole story. Use 2 or 3 key messages in that story. Explain what's new or different about your findings, why that's important to the audience. And then in your text, you provide answers to the most likely questions. Don't include all of the details, but again, use evidence to back your claims. And then there are 2 kinds of evidence. There's hard evidence like facts and statistics, but in communication, there's also soft evidence like personal stories and anecdotes that we can then back up with the hard evidence. And then a headline is what sells your story. It should be eye-catching, believable, easy to read. So that's plain language. It should be brief and accurate. So don't clickbait. It should always use an active voice, and it should be appropriate for the target audience. So with this in mind, you need to write a couple of drafts and then pick your favorite. Some examples. This is from the Prefer project. This was written by Anna Holm. So this is a research paper. This is an overview of critical decision points in the medical product life cycle, where to include patient preference information in the decision-making process. It works very well for a peer audience. But if you look at this paper, it's actually listing those where to include patient preference information. That's a list of 15 decision points. So then if you think of us as simple beings, we like those lists like, 5 ways to lose 5 kilos before the summer. or something like that. So if it's rephrased then into a list, so if you talk about 15 ways to listen to the patient voice, it is still accurate because it is referring to the list that's in this overview, but it's doing it in a succinct and clear, click-worthy way. Again, so then you need to build a story that's going to come underneath this very nice and eye-catching headline. Then you need to have key messages because those are the building blocks for your story. Your story shouldn't have too many key messages because then it gets confusing and too big. So 2 or 3 for one story. Don't make the audience work too hard and limit yourself to what's most important. So if it's a big, big paper, consider dividing it into 2 communications, 2 different stories, just to make sure that the audience understands it and are able to grasp the sort of main message. And those messages, they're clear, concise and succinct, well-framed and conversational. And when we say that, it means it's adapted to your audience and it's in plain language. Then if you want to adapt to your audience, what you need to do is to figure out how your findings will impact them, because that's a way of framing it so it makes sense for us. And you need to remove enough abstraction to get to a level that suits your audience. And when it comes to your results, you should refer to them instead of reciting them. And then you want to avoid jargon and acronyms at all costs, because the meaning can differ very much between even the most adjacent fields, and people are not very familiar with the 3-letter acronyms that you use. Like we are now with the HBP, the Human Brain Project, but it's easier for people to understand if you talk about the Human Brain Project than if you say the HBP. So choosing the right channel then, where you share your stories depends on why you're communicating, and different channels have very different benefits and very different downsides as well. So your own social media gives you control, but it doesn't always give you the reach you want. And channels that have a big reach often have gatekeepers, and they might want to edit your content. So this always boils down to the objective again. So figure out why you're doing this, who you want to inform or influence, where you can find them, and what the best way is to speak to them. So if you have that, if you know that, then the actual communication is going to be so much easier. Communication then is a lot more than text, because we are in a visual world and a digital world, and you can use images to reinforce your message, but it can also get you into trouble. So you need to be as careful about choosing your images as you are about using words. And of course, representation is key, but always avoid a tokenism. So just when you pick a picture to illustrate something, don't pick a person that has all of those diversity aspects represented in the one person. Just make sure you avoid making people tokens, because if you can't do it well, it's better not to do it. And what you need to also remember is to be very mindful of copyright and make sure that any images you use are free to use, and acknowledge the photographer. So if you want to source images for a presentation like this, you should go to Pixabay, Pexels, Unsplash, those places where it's very clear whether you're allowed to use the image or not. Don't just Google, do a Google search and find a picture. Even if it's perfect, it might get you into trouble, and it costs money to infringe on people's copyright. So what we need to talk about as well is what happens if someone else sets the agenda. We already talked about sort of what happens in case of negative publicity, but when you engage with journalists, you need to deliver like a pro to avoid that happening. And if you understand the rules of engagement, it's much, much easier. So we have some tips and tricks for you. If someone wants an interview, what you should do is to look at try and figure out the angle and have a look at what the journalist published before you accept the interview, and ask who else is featured in the article, because sometimes people might want to use 2 sides and opposing views because that makes a good story. And if you know who else is going to be there, you might be able to anticipate the angle. And then come prepared. So we talked about how to write a popular science narrative, basically a press release. Write that in your head and bring that with yourself to the interview. And also remember that there is no such thing as off the record. So if you what you say is juicy enough, it might be used. So what you should do then is to prepare for the soundbite, and that's jargon that means quote. Never use jargon or acronyms because it makes it much, much more difficult for people to understand and for you to get your point across. So make sure that your key messages make good quotes because if they don't, it just might not be used. So help a journalist quote you by preparing clear, well-framed and conversational key messages and then keep repeating them throughout the interview because just making sure that one of them makes a good quote. So you frame them in different ways, you deliver them in different ways, and you keep repeating the same message. So arrive with those messages ready, repeat them again and again and again. And then once you've done your job, you've given your interview, you have to remember that what happens now is the journalist preparing their piece. It's a text or it's a radio interview. And you actually don't have a right to see the full thing before it's published. But if there's time, you can always ask to review your quotes. And I'd recommend that you do that. And if it's being recorded in any way, you have to be aware. So even if it's a print journalist, they might want to take a picture. So think about what you're wearing. Think about sort of washing your hair and putting makeup on if that's something you do normally. And because even if it's a print or even if it's on radio, it might be broadcasted online. And then, of course, if it's TV, it is TV, and then you should be aware that it's being recorded. And then the other thing nowadays with Zoom, we're so used to having our microphones close to our heads that we're forgetting that if you move your head around relative to the microphone, you get audio problems. Your voice will be moving in the room. So just stand still, direct your voice towards the microphone. Always assume you're being recorded. So again, know off the record, even if you can't see the microphone, it might still be there. Try to relax and stay confident, calm, and conversational. Use plain language and dress appropriately. And that means several things, but in relation to microphone etiquette, it means not to wear noisy clothes or jewelry. And also, if you have a beard, be careful if you're being interviewed online, like on Zoom or something, because your microphone might be scraping against your beard, and that's really difficult for the rest of us, the ones on the other hand listening. Angles, necklaces, earrings, that can make a lot of noise and really sort of take away from your message and makes it much more difficult for us to listen to you. So when it comes to camera then, always assume you're on camera. Also, of course, ignore the camera because we don't like people who look straight into the camera. It doesn't feel comfortable. So if you're being interviewed, the journalist is standing in a direction where you don't want to look, you want to look towards the camera, you can ask a friend to stand behind the cameraman or next to the cameraman and make eye contact with that person because it allows us to fix our gaze. And then we have a steady gaze and it's much more attractive. So, and also you look more confident. And when you look confident, people trust you and tend to believe you and listen to you. So makeup, if they offer you makeup, say yes. Even if you don't wear makeup normally, if you're in a television studio, the lights are very bright. And even if you spent an hour in the morning putting your makeup on, you probably need more to look like you slept in the evening. And then don't wear pinstripe shirts, more patterns or shiny clothes. And we've all seen that sort of strobing effect because cameras are not as clever as our eyes. And that's why that happens. And sit up straight and try to gesture normally. And what that means is no sort of gesturing in front of your face because that's distracting. If you have a very small space like a Zoom window like this, try and keep your arms inside the window. Right. If it's live, then you should come prepared, speak slowly, get your message across, keep you cool, stay polite, don't get defensive, and learn how to answer difficult questions. And I think this is what you should do then is to make sure you have time to prepare. If you are not sure how to answer questions, you can tell a journalist that you're in a meeting or about to have a meeting, and you can ask to see questions and call back. And if it's not about your work per se, or if you don't want to make a comment, you can point to a spokesperson. You're in an uncomfortable interview, you should always object if there's bias and error, and don't let controversial or unjustified assumptions slide. So, excuse me. Never confirm anything that's damaging unless they have proof to show you. Don't be drawn into criticism, don't blame, and stop talking. So if journalists are really good at, asking you a question, hearing your response, wanting more, they stay quiet. And there is, in different cultures, the different amounts of time that you can have the silence before it starts making you uncomfortable. And some people react to this by over talking, over answering, and start talking just to sort of fill the silence. And maybe that's what they want. So try not to feel uncomfortable, stay in the silence, wait until they ask you the next question. Then don't use the no comments, because we all assume it's an admission of guilt. Keep your cool, take your time to answer. It's okay to be quiet for a while. Ask to review your quotes, because you have to realize that they might not let you review the full story. Okay, so if you get difficult questions, and this might not have to do with your work, it might have to do with you being the spokesperson for something else that happened with someone else. So we're not assuming you're being sort of accused of scientific misconduct yourself. But if some things are going on, you might get these questions. So if you know something's going on, anticipate those difficult questions and prepare answers ahead of time. You can get your press office to help you. You can get the comms people to help you to prepare you for answering difficult questions, particularly if you are a spokesperson for something. And then what you can do is to bridge to positive messages. But only do that if you cannot answer or do not want to answer, because journalists and the audience, we're not stupid. We know you're avoiding the question. This is what politicians do all the time. But if you want to do that, to answer questions, you still need to be clear, consistent, accurate, and honest. You can use weak responses or strong responses. If you're doing a weak response, you're avoiding the answer, but you're still being clear, consistent, accurate, and honest by saying something like, unfortunately, I cannot discuss this. Do you have other questions? So you're acknowledging the question. Strong response will acknowledge the issue and then bridge to a positive message. So you can say something like, we know of this issue at this time, it's no longer relevant because we are now focusing on, and then you sort of bridge to something else. And those bridges, again, you need to acknowledge the question and show that you understood it, bridge to a key message, control and contribute somehow. And if you're a pro, you can sort of dangle and distract with something else. Okay, so that would be something like, we know of this issue, we're looking into it, but what I think the bigger issue right now is how these findings change how we, and then you introduce something different and hope that they take the bait. So these are some examples borrowed from Media First Co UK. So you can just sort of copy paste this into something that's conversational. So I'm not sure about that, but what I can confirm is, or that's not my experience, what our investigation has shown is, or I'm not sure about that when I talk to members of the public. So this you can use not only when you talk to journalists, you can use it at dinner at home if you want a confused family, or you can use it when you are in a seminar or a conference if you're trying to buy yourself some time, or if you're trying to get out of a difficult question. All right, so if you want more attention, you can use your own social media. You can share your publications there. You can contribute to the discussion. We don't know what's going to happen with Twitter, but that's a lot of academic discussion going on there right now in 2022, at least. We can write editorial text. We can write opinion for blogs, for journals, for news media. But what you can also do as an individual is to stay available. So if you are in contact with journalists, you can give them your number and tell them it's okay to call in case they need to have someone with your expertise in the future. All right, so again, this is a little checklist if you want to do effective and responsible science communication. Always ask yourself why, who, where, what. So why are you doing this? Who do you want to inform or influence? Where can you find that audience, and what's the best way to speak to them? And that was all.